Welcome back. Wrapping up our discussion on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we're in discussion with Catherine Grant, Makokera and Lebohang Pheko. So just coming back to the last part of our conversation, we're talking about equal partnerships and looking at this agreement. Do the conditions exist for countries to negotiate with each other in that way, Lebohang?
Yes and no. The recs are usually, unfortunately, SADC is not really functional as an economic bloc de facto. I think SACU is a lot more effective. It is the customs union, isn't it, to all intents and purposes, and especially because you have a couple of very dominant economies. South Africa being, the big sister in the region, and the resentment and the mistrust from many other economies that comes with that. Even though we're also one of the biggest loan-free, no strings attached investors across the continent as well, in infrastructure and in soft loans, but nevertheless our reputation, regrettably, precedes us. Yeah. So those sorts of power dynamics are reproduced across the continent. So that would be Nigeria in West Africa, that would be Egypt in North Africa, and perhaps Algeria, but not so much. That would be Kenya in East Africa, and of course other small mini hegemons also emerging in East Africa, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so on. But I think in terms of track record, stability, longevity, Kenya being a very strong pillar or anchor state. So if we're not able to deal with those contradictions and those inbuilt resentments, the fact that there are some bigger sisters in the region, we won't be able to move forward, and who are protecting themselves very vigorously, but also reproducing some very toxic power play themselves.
And I want to reflect on that, Catherine. We see that between South Africa and Kenya, as you mentioned. We've seen that with South Africa and Nigeria. Some would say, who can forget the whole MTN saga? So how do we prevent that from being replicated and not having other countries being swallowed up by these existing
I was in Tanzania recently, and this question came up very strongly there in conversations in the SADC context about mutual benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and they're having a very vigorous debate actually amongst different stakeholders in the economy there about this, and South Africa was certainly mentioned very explicitly, and I think that in many ways there is a perception amongst other African countries that the bigger players, the ones that Lebohang's mentioned, are driving this initiative because it is actually a way to bring them together. Funny enough, the regional economic communities haven't allowed the connections, for example, South Africa to Kenya, South Africa to Nigeria yet. We've been operating as the anchor states of our various regions on the continent, but this continental agreement will be the first time that we actually see connections between the big players.
So before we run out of time, I must ask this question. When we talk about free trade, how free is free? What exactly do we talk about?
Free.
Free
for who? Free, yeah, exactly. No, free is a misnomer. Free in many respects comes from the removal of tariffs, of duties. The reality is that most goods move around the world these days completely duty-free. And so I guess that's where free lives up to its name, but the reality is that there are many other mechanisms that impede trade. There are rules of origin, there are non-tariff barriers like standards requirements, packaging, you can have stops at the border, customs documentation issues. So I think anybody who's tried to trade will tell you that there's certainly some costs to be paid. It's not free.
And to add to that, phytosanitary rules, which have inhibited the capacity for African countries to export their goods, especially to the EU, because a few Europeans think that to put it crudely, that African goods are not hygienic enough, which is incredibly insulting, and also illustrates that it's very expensive to export, and that there's an asymmetry in the ways in which global power relations play themselves out. And then the TTIP, which was abandoned now under Trump, but I think it's been held in abeyance, but I don't think these things are ever completely off the shelf, was also causing a massive, a bit of an economic civil war between the European Union and the United States, where the European Union also felt that the United States were being too demanding and playing the big brother, and also making demands across sectors which don't even fall under trade, such as culture, media, graphic design, intellectual property. Interestingly enough, there's very same complaints that African countries and Caribbean countries and Pacific countries had in relation to trading, the negotiations across the EPAs. How can we within the AfCFTA avoid reproducing the same? And we need to be much more creative around that.
So in that token, in 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you each, what do we need to focus on to improve this? Catherine?
Broad-based engagement on these issues. I don't think this should be left to a very small group of government officials from African countries. I think that, you know, we need the private sector, we need civil society in the room.
I agree. I mean, but it has to be bottom-up. It can't be state-to-state entirely, because in many respects, most African people are inherently more integrated socially, culturally, and, you know, informal and parallel trade. So rather than trying to rely on states to legislate, let's also have a bottom-up conversation.
Well, thank you very much to you both for a very informative and educational discussion. Catherine Grant-Makokera, Director at Tutra Consulting Group, and Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective and Political Economist. Well, that's all we have for you on African Perspective.